Hi, everyone. I am joined by Layman Pascal, who I've invited onto the podcast to discuss and process together the recent election results. Layman, of course, dear friend of mine, frequent collaborator, wonderful human being, and was hoping that we could start to unpack and think about what has happened in the last 24 hours and hopefully, engage in some communal sense making around this that will be of value to people out there and to me personally. I'm really interested to hear Layman's take on this and I always appreciate his perspective. So this is going to be just kind of an off the cuff exploration of this and trying to frame some sense around this and to try to, I guess the only thing I would add to that is to try to approach this from as kind of wide and integrative a lens as possible. And so I'll start with that and just say thanks, Lyman. Appreciate you finding the time on short notice to talk about this.
Good to be here, man. I've always got a lot of developmental and meta-shamanic ideas about the political situation, but up front, I'm kind of curious how it lands for you. Like, as a Canadian, we're always expecting the Americans to go down in flames. So it sort of befits the cynicism in which we are already enmeshed.
Mm.
But you, as a citizen of those United States, from my perspective, yeah, how you feeling? How's this land with you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an interesting kind of entry point because, like, for me, yes, it is sort of a domestic issue. But on the other hand, of course, the United States isn't just the United States. It is the nominal de facto maintainer, preserver, enforcer of the world order. And so, the degree to which obviously then American politics impact not just Americans but the world is a big part of this for me. But in terms of like being an American citizen, that's a very kind of fraught thing, which I could say maybe a little bit more about, but just briefly, right? There are like real ways in which it will have a very real impact on me. But particularly, I'm also kind of keenly aware that I am and kind of isolated from the worst that I'm concerned about, owing to however you want to talk about that. And kind of you could use sort of postmodern framings around privilege and identity and all that. I am more insulated from what I fear will be the worst of what could come out of this situation. And again, I could unpack that more. So there's feelings mixed up with that. But of course, at the same time, I'm also very concerned about what will be the direct impacts on my daily life, and particularly just the sphere of discourse over the next 4 years and how acrimonious and bitter and heated and resentful and potentially violent and disruptive that will all be, I think is one of the things I'm really also sitting with of just this is now a kind of intensity that we've committed ourselves to for the next 4+ years, and so that's landing. So anyway, I can say a lot more, but those are just a number of thoughts that come up briefly. And one last framing thing I did want to just offer around this is in particular why I'm interested in your perspective is because, I am in it and we're all kind of part of the mimetic tribes that we're part of, but I do value the ability to try to sort of get above and beyond that to try to see the interaction of mimetic tribes itself as a way of understanding what's going on. But also then to try to have, kind of empathy, compassion, try to see perspectives that aren't necessarily one's own. And so I feel like that's a value, particularly after an event like this, where it's very hard otherwise to try to entertain what could possibly feel good, or an occasion for progress or movement forward in something. And so trying to find, if not those silver linings, at least that ability to step into a different way of seeing this from other perspectives and from sort of a meta perspective, I feel like is something that integrative, metamodern, integral thought does very well, and that you in particularly do exceptionally well. So I just wanted to also throw that in there. But that's some thoughts out of the gate. What about you? Where are
Sure.
you coming at this from?
Well, it's interesting. Like it is, I made a joke about the Canadian perspective on this, but there are two ways in which it's a trans-American phenomenon, right? One that you indicated was that what goes on in the United States is of significance to the rest of the world, right? And for Canadians in particular, right, our glass of water shakes when the American dinosaur moves. But in another sense, there's also planetary significance, which is this is not an isolated phenomenon,
Mm,
right? That the rise of the quasi-authoritarian clown is something we've seen going back to Berlusconi in Italy. We've
mm,
seen it with Boris Johnson in England, that it is one of the standard attractors at this moment in the world historical emergence of planetary civilization, and that roughly the same factors that have gone on in this election are going on and have been going on across the progressive industrialized world. I think there's a breakdown of the balances of the modernist order, that it's proven itself incapable of handling these kinds of turbulence, and that what's the mistakes, let's call them, made by the center left professionalist elites, the way they've misunderstood the dynamics of the public. I think that's broadly spread around the world, and all countries are kind of facing that. And then, secondarily, at the level of like how we analyze this, it's a bit tricky because there's an appropriate micro level, like how are we doing as individuals? How do we sympathize with the most vulnerable populations who are at risk under this period of time? But also, there's a kind of obviousness to those things that we want to pull out of, and how does this play at the macro level, and how should we be thinking about politics in general, right? What are the standard grooves into which people fall, which cause them to be non-learners of the political instance, if that makes any sense, right? I mean, we watched Trump's speech this morning with the kids before they went off to school, and the kids had an appropriately childish reaction, like, who is this malignant clown? But they're acting like that's a new observation. Everybody already knows that piece of information, right? Just detecting a problem in the population or a problem with a candidate and being astonished or being horrified, that's not really giving you any new information or analysis into the situation. If they get beyond that, we do have to go to some meta levels.
yeah. No, and there's so much there I want to kind of tease apart because I'm sitting with a number of things on this front that I think are really important because there are these kind of superficial elements to the authoritarian clown figure that you're describing, right? And they are the outlandish, the kind of crude, the kind of bucking of norms and sort of standards of couthness and that sort of a thing, right? There's a kind of intensity to that, which has a kind of superficial or aesthetic character to it. And one of the things I'm interested to try to tease apart is like, um, well, to what degree is that just superficial? To what degree? Because I'll put it this way: one of the things that for me has been so difficult about this phenomenon is that as someone who cares a lot about complexity, obviously, nuance, and general senses of sort of development and progress, that when I see what lands to me in the register as sort of like regressive, crude, undeveloped, simplistic, and lacking in complexity, etc., which I would identify as characteristics of these figures. And then when I see that either actually sort of explicitly celebrated or at the very least just kind of ignored, I feel like there's a concern there that for me something that is sort of glaringly obvious is again either being just like missed by a broad swath of the population or deemed insignificant in a way that deeply disturbs me if these are my values. But I'm interested in the prospect that maybe those are superficial markers in various ways that could be sort of reconsidered, right? Maybe a lot of people see the clownishness. They see that it's clownishness, but there's a deeper thing that for them is more important than getting behind the clown. And maybe they even see the other deeper, darker aspects that are very concerning for me, some of the authoritarianism and the aspects of racism and neo-fascism. But again, for them, that's not the thing for them. It's this other thing. And so part of me is sitting with that tension because for other people in my relationship with others, I want to be able to understand what that is, right? Where it's sort of like, okay, if it's not this thing that you're somehow assenting to or affirming as being somehow good, and clearly, the majority of voters assented to and affirmed it in some way, then it's like, what is the it, right? If it's not this superficial clown that you're giving your thumbs up to, what is the it that you are giving your thumbs up to? And then that's for my interpersonal and kind of collective relationship. But then there's also for me the prospect of, is that something I could assent to and affirm to? Is there a moment of possibility here that is actually under the surface, that maybe despite the superficial chaos is actually a potentiality for shifting the system in a genuinely positive direction? So those are a number of things that I'll throw at you. Any thoughts on any of that?
I think there's a really interesting question as to what degree and in which ways complexity-oriented people can take on board the Trump movement. And they're going to have lots of opportunities to wonder about that over the next 4 years. And like you were saying
Mm.
earlier, it's going to be confronting us, right? John Mulaney's routine about the horse loose in the hospital was a gorgeous piece of comedy, but it indicates that you're going to be constantly barraged with erratic updates for the next 4 years. There's going to be no calming down in this system. When I think about those people, right, you can appreciate Trump as an extraordinary figure. Like what he's done as an individual is unparalleled pretty much, right? His whole life, businessman and mogul and TV star and Celebrity Apprentice and all these things, and to enter an election and decimate the Republican competition, and then to win the election with the first one ever with no political or military experience, and then to almost win the next one, and then to win again by an even greater margin. It shows that he understands something or instinctively vibes with something that is very functional and historically very unique. So I think we want to really ask ourselves what there is to learn from the dynamics that he's put into play and how those could be used maybe for other types of more developmental politics. Because what would it take to be able to get behind a character like that? For me, if there was a strongly ecological and labor oriented Trump who evinced deep emotional compassion for people, I could probably get behind most of his other characteristics. Right. So that
Well,
would be,
we'll hold
yeah.
that thought just
Go
for 1 second. I mean, so that's an interesting thought experiment, right? Because in it directly relates to this question. So for me, there's a lot of political differences that obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'll just state that affirmatively, that exist for me and Trump. But if I were to imagine the same persona, but with a set of policy concerns that I actually do care about, in particularly find this a shared sense of urgency, and let's say climate, issues in particular would come to mind. Maybe some kind of vast systemic education reform, whatever, right? Like, let's say those were the issues, but then it was still the clown trying to get these issues sort of instituted. Then there's sort of a thought experiment for myself of like, can I understand what it would be like to find the character loathsome, but somehow affirm because of this other thing? And then at the same time, what that raises for me is like, but can you separate these two? Are they actually distinguishable and all that? But I will just say that because I do, that engenders empathy and openness and compassion in me, which is valuable. And I do know people who will say things like, well, I don't like this guy, but I like his policies or whatever. And again, that's troublesome for me because even those policies I find often themselves somewhat loathsome, but depending on what they are. But still, I'm trying to sort of enter into a space where this doesn't just end in a kind of either or dualism, but there's some sense of like, I can openly conceive of that because I could do it if the circumstances were different. So anyway, that was just maybe a brief reflection on that last point, but keep going.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important thought experiment for people who want to be at the front edge of this and who don't want to succumb to ordinary forms of population polarization, is to ask themselves which aspects of this conjoin with other values or other protocols could they actually get behind or would be willing to feel in an affirmative way. And we look at our population and we go, okay, regardless of the election outcome, whatever it is, 30 to 50% of the population was going to feel this way anyway. So, how do we incorporate those people? How are we sympathetic towards them? And there's also a question of like, where do you put blame, right? In some ways, for a progressively oriented developmental person, the dumbest place to put the blame is on a huge mass of anomalous, ignorant, misinformed voters who are somehow under the sway of the regressive tendencies whereby nihilism starts to become fascism. That doesn't help us very much, right? So we can look at what might be driving them, the argument that was made by the Institute for Cultural Evolution for Trump's last victory was that even though a lot of these people, including a lot of evangelical Christians, recognize Trump as not a good embodiment of their values, they thought that he was going to be the sledgehammer that opened up their chance to modify America back into a more classical ethnocentric direction. But I think the main thing here is the right seems to be more united in a dissatisfaction with the left than it is in a positive unified vision. There's
Yeah.
many different factions in the Trump coalition. And the main thing they share is they all hate the Democrats. And so the key in some ways to empathizing with them seems to me to be, can you also hate the Democrats?
Uh-huh. Well, and I can track with that. Well, all right, a couple things there. I want to unpack that a little bit first. You said that what would be particularly most unhelpful is to kind of provide some kind of explanatory account that places, if not the blame, then at least sort of the causal, emphasis on a kind of large, clearly majority, I guess in this case. Let's just say a large amount of the electorate that is uninformed and maybe swayed by groupthink. And to be totally honest, I recently published two pieces in which I basically try to make that kind of argument because I think that there's actually something to that argument. Now, it doesn't mean that I think that that means this is where we think of blame, right? Because that would be singularly unhelpful, right? In the same way that like someone who is systemically underprivileged, trying to blame them for failing their math test would be like completely missing the blame. And if is that kind of what you're talking about? Because I do try to situate whatever that causal explanation is in a systemic context, which for me is about the breakdown of our education system and the quality of education and the lack of sort of developmental containers in which people could actually become the kinds of informed, free-thinking citizens that a functioning democracy actually requires. I see those systems and structures as lacking and those
Yeah.
institutions is largely broken. And so that would be, I guess you would say, the actual blame aspect of this. But I do think we can't ignore the fact that there are some of those deeper aspects, dynamics related to education and informedness and sort of overall complexity in thinking. And then just on that note too, another thing that I'm concerned about, which we can come back to in a second, which is that I do also see some people trying to do what also was like make a move that was made last time, which was basically like, well, the Democrats failed because they weren't progressive enough. And so if we just had a super, even radically progressive figure, then this would actually galvanize people. And then rather than settling for this sort of milquetoast liberalism, we'd get, some kind of really, some progressivism with teeth to it. And I think there's something to that, but I also feel like that's also missing something. Because if we are lacking an informed electorate, it doesn't matter if it's a progressive candidate with progressive policies or conservative leaning towards neo-fascist. That seems to be a structural issue that needs to be attended to. And if we just place the blame on the liberals not being liberal enough, I feel like we haven't really accounted for enough. What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, we're looking at a problem which is, to me in general, that there isn't adequate production of a new civic spirit that renders populations adequate to face the meta crisis in a developmental and complexifying manner. So to further factionalize the population, right? To be like, okay, this is the left, but then actually the wrong part of the left was in charge, right? There's something to that, right? There's something about, for example, the movement that organized itself around Bernie Sanders and the way that that was ostracized by the mainstream Democratic Party that tells us something about the possible success conditions
Yeah.
of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple as like, it's not that AOC would have defeated Trump in a way that Kamala could not have,
Mm.
right? It's not that kind of simple factionalization. I think the danger from a both a futuristic political orientation, but also a personal, emotional, and spiritual orientation is just this temptation to write off half your population,
Yeah.
right? And that they're misinformed or they're nihilistic fascist or they're inherently bad somehow, right? So inherently bad already makes them an irreconcilable other who we can't have anything to do with, and that shuts our own heart down. The idea that they are somehow seduced into a regressive mode that will undermine the achieved values of the nation. That's true, but that's not something that's produced in this election cycle, right? That's an intergenerational problem. The establishment of nihilistic conditions and the failure to produce the American nation spirit, that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, in various ways. So that problem is real, but that's not the local problem. And yes, you have to start setting up the systemic conditions by which people are more robust, more healthy, more intelligent, more complex, etc., going forward. But that's not particular to this issue, right? You could have made the same argument relative to those things about the election and reelection of George W. Bush. I think the misinformed or the misinformation aspect, I think that will be a dangerous one because there's a temptation among the left now in a really odd way to think they have to be the policers of information. And it's not a good look for them. It doesn't endear them to the public, and it really doesn't support democratic values in general. So if the lesson you learn is a bunch of bad, dumb people were allowed to access the wrong information, once we get in charge, we'll stop that from happening, then you are doing your part to create a different kind of fascist situation.
Hmm.
But one of the things that stands out to me is um, there's a big coalition of people voting for Trump for different kinds of reasons. Some of those reasons are, decadence, corruption, nihilism, that kind of thing. Some of it is we're looking at lower level paradigmatic value systems trying to assert their values into the system as best they can. And some of it is this alternative strategy, which I think we don't give enough credence to, that the shamanic lens sort of opens up, which is are there seemingly irrational and nonlinear patterns at play in the collective unconscious that people who are maybe not that nice and maybe not that smart might nonetheless have access to, right? We don't really know this, but we do have to take the possibilities seriously. One of the things I often think in terms of left and right is the right has a tendency to instinctively locate the location of a problem. They just don't know the appropriate professional solution to that problem. So when they're saying, hey, something feels really wrong about the economy, and hey, something feels really dangerous about the border and immigration, and we go, well, your solutions are dumb and your analysis is paltry. And you're like, oh, yeah, but they might be onto something,
Yeah.
right? But it might be that if there could be advanced left leaning solutions that emphasize the problems that the right is pointing out, then you have a different kind of political machinery where those two sides are complementary. But I don't think we should write off the mass intelligence of these people just because it's not operating at the level of the individual rational intellect.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And on the whole, I think we are basically saying the same things, but per usual, you're being a bit more articulate about it than I and a bit more nuanced. Whereas for me, these couple of articles exploring sort of the issue, I frame it in terms of sort of Keegan's work and his orders of consciousness and being in over our heads, which, is sort of this complexity gap issue that we face of there are these modern demands of life or demands of modern life that are kind of a hidden curriculum that place certain demands on our cognitive abilities, and the expectations of sort of optimally performing in this modern world are that we can do certain things and behave in certain sort of organizational capacities, which when you actually study that empirically, a lot of people aren't up to those challenges because, well, and then again, I think it gets down to institutional limitations and other things like that. And I do think that there's a legitimate way of kind of framing it through that lens. But again, to be careful not to blame people for institutional structural failures in that sense. Of course, this is all kind of a loop and a kind of feedback cycle because in a democracy, we're the ones who help generate those systems through our. So that's kind of this terrible limitation that we're facing, which is there's a wonderful book recently I've been reading called the Evolution of Knowledge by Jürgen Renn. He has a term for this where basically the kind of level of knowledge that institutions are able to basically, he calls it enclosure entrapment, I think is something like this, where basically, if people are generating the institutions, then they're limited by kind of the cognitive abilities of the people that they're drawing on. But at the same time, if those are the institutions that are generating the enculturation function, then people get limited by the cognitive kind of expectations of the institutions, and then you're sort of entrapped. So anyway, I see a lot of that at play. But to pivot to the broader point that you're getting at, which I also would agree with, it is a place where we could identify some real ways of finding, at least for me, consonance with or let's say, agreement on where the Democrats are wrong, hating the Democrats about how, whereas the Republicans or folks on the right, as you're describing, are able to identify the location of these problems, but not necessarily have the correct level of sort of systemic solutions to them. I think one of the biggest problems that I've seen is that people, Democrats on the left, whatever, however you want to frame that group, basically just write off the entire intuitive insights that are being generated in that space. It's like there's no problem at the border, and if you say so, then you're racist, right? Or if you say anything besides this, we've gotten into this sort of like mimetic polarized trap where even just to identify as a problem what millions of people are identifying as problems is to somehow be to align yourself with their proposed set of solutions. And I find that to be particularly sort of limiting and probably inherently counterproductive and sort of self-destructive, because these are real problems. And if we can acknowledge that there's a reality to the problems, even while we can also acknowledge that the proposed solutions might be stupid, awful, terrible, extreme, what have you, then we could actually get somewhere. But for various reasons, many of which are opaque to me, that the ability to do that has not yet entered the sort of political discourse. So I think that that's how I'm reading what you're saying, and in which case I feel like there's a lot of agreement and alignment with that, and that is a potential way into finding again deeper connection, empathy, and sort of alignment with folks that maybe the solutions are disagreed upon, but we can at least share the sentiment that there's a deep structural problem there.
Yeah. I think that's one of the ways to think about how to sympathize with the huge bulk of your fellow citizens who are obviously in this mode. And this mode is partly serious and partly performative. You know, if you talk to a flat earther, it's not clear that they entirely believe what they're saying. They partly believe it and they partly feel like, yay, I get to get away with saying this nonsense. And then that's something you can relate to as well. Just the joy and the sense of liberty and the sense of have we pulled something off? I think that's understandable at a human level. I think one of the things I would like to say to people who are like in our spaces is how important it is to wrestle with the not quite paradox, but the complementary sides of this, where on the one hand it matters and where on the other hand it doesn't matter, right? It absolutely matters if you have a situation, if something emboldens or disemboldens the kind of people that are going to stand outside your high school shouting violent threats at trans kids, that makes a big difference, right? It makes
Mm-hmm.
a big difference whether the autonomy of women's control over health exists or doesn't exist in a system. It makes a big difference whether uh, people are impoverished through a tariff system that pretends to be supporting the industrial base of the heartland, or whether you're actually supporting the industrial base of the heartland. These things make a real difference. But when we're in these communities that feel into or sometimes purport to be a leading edge of complexity, I think we have to take seriously what I would call the Illuminati approach, which is we're not passive relative to election outcomes. We understand that every public contest has one of two or a couple of outcomes, and our general attitude has to be that we don't live and die based on that, right? That we're more like the Coca-Cola Corporation. We need to have a plan and a sentiment for if this outcome happens and if this outcome happens. We're ambidextrous. So I would want our whole community to be encouraged to feel like we don't know the outcome. We have a plan for both outcomes. And regardless of what it is, we're not going to be excessively buoyed or excessively despondent, right? That we're in a trans political strategy position. I think that's important for our general self esteem. But I think a couple of interesting things we could dive into. One is, what is Trump doing right, in terms of political success? And another one is, what are Democrats doing wrong? You touched on one element is the tendency to be uh, faux altruistically dismissive and rigid and dogmatic. And if you acknowledge any kind of difficulty with any of these things, you're a problem. Now they're put in a difficult position, right? Like Kamala was the border czar, so to speak, right? So it's hard to really say there's a problem, but also say you were in charge of it. It's hard to be like, yeah, people think the economy is terrible, but look, it's actually making incremental improvements, and we don't want to undermine the fact that we were part of the administration that was doing that. So it's a complicated position, whereas the Republicans are at liberty to make really simple assessments, and that gives them a certain flexibility and leeway the Democrats don't have. But there's a sense in which you need to be simple and mythic. They have a problem with that. They have a problem taking on board um, incongruous and unsettling sensations, I would argue, right? The whole there was a moment where Kamala had the energy and had the money. The vibes moment when she first comes in, if they could have had a few more of those, she would be president right now. There
Mm.
was a magic there, but it was a magic of, hey, we're great and we have things under control and we can win this. And when you talk to Obama, it's like, well, things are difficult, but fundamentally hope and change and optimism. And there's something about just trying to sell you the positive in an old fashioned, slightly outdated marketing sense that bedevils the center left neoliberals. They can't really accept challenge and divisiveness and conflict and discomfort. They want to squelch discomfort, right? They didn't want to admit that Joe Biden appeared cognitively deficient to most of the population.
Hmm.
They didn't want to risk having an open primary where they ran candidates to vet them to see if they could actually win an election. They haven't been able to do anything like what Trump has done, which is take on board to his team people who openly hate him. J.D. Vance used to call him a fascist. RFK Jr., and I'm curious to see what he'll do in healthcare because he's a mixed guy. He's got some really interesting ideas as well as some wacky ones. But he called Trump basically like a subhuman fascist progressive right up until he joined the team.
Hmm.
So Trump is demonstrating that he's willing to take on antagonism and unsettling qualities and fold them into what he's doing. And that's an interesting sign of strength. But at any rate, it's a sign of strength that the Democrats usually can't do. I've made an argument for years that the Democrats basically would have controlled the government nonstop for the last 20 years if their candidates had absorbed their primary rivals as their running mates, right? If Hillary had taken Bernie or Elizabeth Warren as her running mate, she would have been president, right? If Kamala had taken anybody else who was charged and interesting, Marianne Williamson, anything like that, but instead they take somebody who's going to be nice and be supportive, be loyal, and play along. And that kind of commitment to not being challenged, to not having to feel discomfort and antagonism, I think that's made the Democrats quite weak.
Yeah, I hear a lot of that, and I think it's a very charitable reading, and I don't think it's wrong, but I do think that one could certainly make the argument that any machine politics works kind of the way you're talking about, right? I mean, just look at the ways that, historically always there's been a primary challenge. People say terrible things about the other candidate, and then as soon as the candidate gets chosen, they just fall in line. And then, of course, we have all this audio and video of them saying these terrible things, but it's like, and then you could even phrase all of that negatively and see that as sort of a political doublespeak that's all kind of opportunistic, Machiavellian sort of thing. And arguably, I mean, and also look at how the way Bernie Sanders fell in line with the Democratic establishment in order to when they had their candidate, right? So like I would say that does exist on the left as well, but there is a unique aspect to the kind of Trump movement in the way that Trump is able to absorb with a kind of anti-fragile way a kind of destabilization that makes the Democrats much more fragile. And I'm not sure exactly what that is. It's certainly a generative, or rather it's a it serves him, right? But I also, feel like maybe what allows for that to happen might even be some dark and sinister, ways of playing the game that might not necessarily be the sorts of things we should look to emulate or scale, in terms of this. So those are just a couple things. But you also, I just want to double click on what you said earlier, which I very much agree with, is that, we should strive to be, and by we I mean, yeah, folks in this space and trying to be engaging with the demands of our time at the leading edge of complexity. We should be beyond sort of party politics, right? Like there are ways, as you say, that these things are very real, but it's also like maybe not just Coca-Cola, but like the Bene Gesserit, like there's sort of like we're just going to keep being here, over generations and generations. And I guess that's kind of your Illuminati sort of metaphor there, is that like work needs to be done and we can't get too swayed or moved or doubled over by whatever the particular kind of political winds of the day are. And so I agree with that. And that's also a tension in me as well, though, because when I look at the political winds of our day, they do actually seem to be gales. They seem to be hurricanes in a way that I feel like there is a historic scale and scope to what's going on right now, but I'm also not closed to being told that I'm just in a mimetic bubble that's probably falling, for a certain kind of propagandizing of how significant this all is. I know that that kind of happens every election. This is the most important election. This is the most important election. But I do genuinely worry for the state of America, the future of America, in terms of its institutional complexity being maintained, right? Like, we built up a lot of complexity in terms of this elaborate system that at its best is able to engage in sort of like a kind of democracy that functions decently well in sort of modern era industrial, style nation state. Like that can kind of work. Now, I see the very real possibility of that eroding, and that those checks and balances going away, the various kinds of levers that exist in this multi-systemic structure, being broken down to a point where actually we're suddenly going to look around and be like, hey, this looks a lot more like some kind of fascist state now than a kind of Republican democratic state. And as I guess also someone who studied ancient history and the move from sort of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, to see how basically various kinds of populist sensibilities rose up and then, led to that happening. Or, look at what happened after the French Revolution and this sort of like populist movement that then got co-opted by imperialism. Like, we've seen this story before, going all the way back to Plato, talking about how democracies lead to autocracies. So, like, the playbook seems to be there, and we seem to be following it. And I guess all I'm just saying is that maybe these aren't just slight gale winds. These are like, are we actually staring down the barrel of like a full-on, full-blooded neo-fascist kind of takeover of our governmental institutions, or is that just radically overblowing the severity of what we're currently facing? Because some people will just say that's nonsense, and then there's this mimetic divide when people talk about, man, you're so out to lunch, you think that that's what's going on. But when I read, say, the New York Times, I feel like, well, there's a good case to be made that that's what's going on. So I don't know. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I got to stand up for Caesar and Augustus. I mean, the oligarchic elites were holding that state back. They had some good ideas. Uh, um, yeah, it's an interesting thing. We do see these things fluctuate in cultures in general, and in particular, we see them fluctuate in the kinds of majoritarian representational nation states that have been set up over the last couple of hundred years. And for the last, let's say, 50 to 100 years in particular, there's been a pretty stable order in most of the advanced nations. And it's been a constitutional system with an executive and a fluctuating oscillation between two dominant factions, which are like, in integral speak, it's like blue hearts with orange minds and orange hearts with green minds. And they've gone back and forth. And together they've enabled a massive bipartisan support to the military industrial complex. And over time, they've also had a slight tilt toward progress, like a 49-51 kind of favoring for the neoliberals. Because there's a slight technological and cultural progress that's made. And in some ways, that progress is maintained, that slight advantage is maintained by the constant threat of the irrational right wing regression, right? Every election cycle is, oh my God, you can't let the irrational right wing regression occur. You've got to vote for the neoliberal consensus no matter what,
Mm.
right? You're like, yeah, that would be convincing if it wasn't every single time. And it's basically kind of been that way since the mid 20th century, maybe a bit earlier than that. So that's the situation. That's the stability that's been dominant, but it's clearly not holding, right? There's been a consistent revelation of the failure of that approach over the last number of cycles, and not only in the United States. So now you've got a technological and a meta crisis and a digital society transition. You've got all these different factors in play that are upsetting that balance. And as that balance is upset, you have a possibility of advancement and you have a possibility of regress, right? I don't think we're committed to and neo-fascist takeover of the government. But I would say that in some ways that is the inevitable outcome if the more advanced half of the population can't get its act together and harness those forces. If it continues to reject those forces and play them like they're the boogeyman that always allows them to regain power, they're going to fail, and we are going to get something approximating a fascist regress. Now, fascism is a complicated topic. I have a slightly different take on it than the textbooks do, but I think what we're seeing is that the platform we're on has become unstable, right? And that can be a moment of advancement, that can be a moment of regress, and the regress is very possible.
What do you make of this thought, which is that again, this is like really looking for a silver lining here, but if there's a sense in which the form of a democratic institution that we'd been working with was not like able to meet the challenges of our particular moment, owing to the kind of just scale of the problem, and at this point kind of the bloated scale of our bureaucracy and the way that we do kind of political business in this country, that we're seeing in America for decades, a kind of gridlock, a kind of stuckness, and yet climate change was barreling on and all these other issues were happening, and yet there seemed to be a kind of systemic inability to rise to that kind of I don't know, level of intervention. That again, a lot of people seeing that get frustrated with the democratic process and then start favoring some kind of more strong authoritarian ways of intervening in various problems. That if you're really looking for a silver lining here, maybe Trump is just a very clumsy, awful way of restructuring the democratic system to level up to a degree of sort of interventional causal impact that's possible by basically reshuffling the kind of institutional structure through a kind of gross authoritarian push that might itself kind of moderate in the future. And then when the dust settles, maybe we actually have a reconfigured political entity that could kind of have enough muscle to tackle big global systemic issues because it's been kind of reconfigured, but is moderated. What do you make of that idea?
I got to pause there. I'll come back to it. I just realized there's a pie in the oven that I'm supposed to poke and take out. Hold
Okay, great.
on. Oh, my apologies. Say I left a pumpkin pie in the oven before she went out, and I promised to look after it.
Did you save it? Is it still edible?
It looks okay, smells good. My pokey stick came out clean, so I've got it cooling, and I'm hoping for the best. Yeah, where were we?
Well, I was asking about this notion that were we
Oh yeah,
experiencing?
the
Yeah,
silver lining
yeah,
question. That's a tricky one, right? Like it could be if it is, but if it isn't, then it isn't, right? I think there's no
indeed.
guarantee that that will be the effect, and there's a lot of I think there's something interesting about, let's broadly call it, the left, that always imagines the transformative moment, right? There'll be a moment when the people wake up, when the people rise up, and maybe if things get bad enough or unsettled enough, that will activate the progressive movement in a way that it hitherto hasn't done. I think that almost never occurs. I think it's a left wing superstition. And in general, when things get worse, people function worse. They're not activated to their best under conditions of degradation.
Yeah.
However, it is possible, and I think this is the demand. This is the value of, in a certain way, blaming the Democratic Party, right? Because what we want is to figure out how we can incorporate the lessons of the event. And part of the lessons of the event are going to be uh, the disruption and the unsettlement and the revelation of the insufficiency of the legacy institutions. Not that they all need to be obliterated and replaced. There's some complementarity between regenerating them and inventing new institutions that's important. But what we need to do is call upon whoever's capable to try to absorb the lessons of the event. And one of those lessons is, why has it been successful? And another lesson is, what's made it necessary? What's made it seem to people as if the existing order is no longer sufficient to hold sway, stabilize, and allow us to thrive into the future?
Yeah, I will say maybe this will land as controversial for some folks, but I totally agree with your analysis of the superstition of sort of popular uprising when things get bad from the left that will and I think that just real quick, this is an interesting context to talk about this briefly because I think it's an important point, but doesn't get brought up. Is that there is this kind of Marxist notion of the revolution, right? That like the proletariat will rise, and it's just as natural as any Hegelian dialectic will lead you to believe. And when this happens, of course, then we'll get this great, classless Marxist utopia. That never happened. And it's interesting because a number of Marxist thinkers in the 20th century started to come to terms with that, and you got this sort of postmodern move where Horkheimer and Adorno are like basically in the dialectic of enlightenment. They're like, nope. This is my reading anyway. It's sort of like because they're looking around at basically super capitalist, America, and they're like, look at all these kind of conformist, consumerist people going about their day. The proletariat's being oppressed, but they're like kind of buying in literally to their own oppression. What's going on here? This doesn't fit with our sort of Marxist dialectics here. And they were basically that led to just, basically throw out the whole notion of rationality itself is kind of this totalitarian thing, which leads you to a kind of postmodern aporia where, what are you going to do then? And then you get someone like Habermas who critiques that. It's like, well, that's not quite the way to look at it. And he tries to do this reconstructive dialectical materialism based in developmental theory, which, if you apply that lens, actually does account for what we actually see in society, which is that there are real reasons why people buy into their own oppression. And actually, what we want to see happen, if we can ever achieve a kind of emancipatory, liberatory movement, wide scale in political discourse and in society at large, is people need to have the developmental capacities to lean on in order to think for themselves and to push back against the kind of consumerist, commodified bullshit propaganda machine that has sort of been manufacturing consent for however long. But that takes critical thinking skills, and it takes learning, and it takes a kind of deeper interiority and reflection, and those are the products of a good education system that can actually really develop full thinking, free thinking people, full capacity people in that way. That's what's actually needed. And ironically, the proletariat, in a sense, will continue to be sort of streamlined or steamrolled and basically made active participants in their own subjugation, as we see like in a lot of Trumpian populist politics, but also it happens on the left all the time as well, until there's actually like collective what would you say, advancement, development of sort of the capacities that lead to genuine critical thought that can push back against those structures, right? And so I think that Habermasian approach is like, oh yeah, it's if you're holding out hope for some kind of Marxist proletariat uprising, good luck. And at the same time, don't just give up on the whole project entirely of sort of enlightenment and rationality, but like if we really care about emancipation, then like we should invest in education and the deepening and developing of human beings. And that, I feel like, is what's missing from so much of the conversation. And the last thing I'll say about that, it's missing from the election analysis postmortem breakdown thing, right? I saw on CNN, it's like, well, what happened? And it's like, well, again, it was the economy, stupid. And I just want to say, no, it's the development, stupid. It's like we don't live in a society in which we have these kinds of institutions that are forming the sorts of people who have the skills and the resources and the kind of access to those resources and educational opportunities that can allow that kind of thing to take hold in the way that we want it. And then we wind up seeing these Trumps again and again, and the left can't understand that until there's some kind of a developmental left that can be like, oh, we need to do it this way instead. So anyway, maybe that was just a ramble in a rant, but I wanted to say that. Yeah.
You hear that, Jeremy Johnson? Brendan hates the proletariat.
No, and Jeremy
No,
said
no, I know
something
what you mean.
that I do agree with, which brings us back to to what degree do we need to blame the kind of milquetoast liberalism and lean into a more progressive politics? And like I'm open to that, and I think that there is clearly the Hillary Clintons and the Kamala Harrises and the Joe Bidens are not going to cut it going forward. So this thing needs to be redone and reimagined if we're going to see a response to this kind of new kind of Trumpist populism. But anyway, I'm rambling too much. Give me more of
Yeah,
your take.
there's a lot of questions here, right? There's questions like, what does it actually require in order to move us forward politically, right? And then that's got the integrals. We'll call it a lower right and a lower left component, right? We need more advanced protocols for collective decision making. The current voting system and the current legislature and the current way we organize people and make decisions can only get us the kinds of solutions we always get, and there's slightly better or slightly worse versions. We also need a new kind of collective spirit, right? Where the moods, the mood of the left and the mood of the right, are not sufficient to unite the nation. There,
Mm,
in fact, is no nation spirit, and this is not unique to the United States, which is at war between two major competing nations who want control of the state. The
mm,
Canadian nation spirit has been eroding for decades, right? We have not had leaders for many decades who have been cultivating it, and most countries haven't. There's been no real interest in producing a rich, evolving, ongoing civic spirit that has sacredness to it and would be capable of adapting to the new conditions. And you need that in order to start to bridge these gaps. So there's that question. But there's also, in terms of post-mortem election analysis, like what happened, which means why didn't Kamala win, right? Because in many ways, she's the better, not necessarily the better candidate, but the better side to be on if you care about people and if you're broadly informed. And what happened was not the economy, stupid, right? I mean, I think there's an obviousness to the fact that the people say what's important to them, and by that they mean here's what we need our politicians to say back to us in order to give us confidence. And they're routinely saying immigration and the economy feels insufficient. And so you need, and if the Democrats aren't going out there saying, listen, the border and immigration are huge problems, and the economy is radically not where we need it to be, and we're going to change course. If you don't hear that from them, then they're giving up a
mhm,
huge amount of the collective energy. There's also a problem of who do you choose? The Democrats have this habit of choosing vetted legacy candidates. Hillary was a legacy candidate. Biden was a legacy candidate. Kamala was next in line. They didn't run any challenges to find out whether people liked her. In fact, anybody who watched the last cycle of Democratic primaries knows she was extremely unpopular, right? So they're not picking candidates who can function. They're not trying to speak to the issues that the American people say, here are our main issues. And then the other thing, other than maybe the magical demeanor, like we could get into Trump as dark shaman, which is an interesting topic for me. But I want to say that event and stunt is the logic of the contemporary political scene, not policy.
mhm,
That when Kamala came in, the moment where we go from Biden's out, Kamala's in, it's the DNC, it's all about vibes, we don't even know what we stand for. She takes the lead, the money pours in, that is a successful moment for her. And then people say, hey, what about your policies? And even her enemies say, come on, you got to give us your policies. And she starts to try to, and nobody cares, right? In the back room, policy matters, but for the public, it doesn't matter. They need to see stunts and events. They need to see that you are exciting, right? And this is what Trump gives them. He's constantly startling. He's constantly exciting. You don't know what he's going to say next. Oh my God, Tulsi and RFK are on his side now. Holy shit, Elon Musk is jumping around on stage. All right, all these sorts of things are the essence of politics in a hypermediated age. And the democratic control structure, which again exists in multiple nations in the world, can't take that seriously. It seems too chaotic for them, but you're going to need to because you get a massive free publicity, which Trump always gets, where even networks that were against him ran his stuff because you can't not run astonishing material.
mm,
But the energy, the takeover of the cultural and social energy which a candidate has to do comes from these startling displays. It comes from the spectacle. It comes from the incongruity. It comes from the freshness of the move. It has nothing to do with your policies. Nobody wants to hear them, right? So there's a professionalism on the left
mhm,
which sabotages itself by trying to speak too earnestly to the
mm.
fact based reality, which is important. It's absolutely important for setting up your actual policies. It just is unrelated to mobilizing broad populations.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And what's difficult about that is that what we ideally want is both. And actually, you're a great example, Layman, because you both have the flair and the charisma that is very enjoyable to watch as sort of a persona and kind of at that level that you're talking about. But then you can, launch into these long, you could say policy style conversations around ideas at a very nuanced and sophisticated level. But the point would be that's a rather rare set or configuration of skills. And it seems like most of the time you're going to have one or the other. I would say Trump is all charisma and no policy, essentially. And the Democrats are trying to be kind of all policy and no flair. That'd be one kind of simplistic way. And so to get a figure who can do both of those, I think is inherently difficult. And not, which isn't to say that's not the answer, because, if we're supposed to be sort of vetting the best candidates for the most important job in the world, can't we draw on 350 million people that might have that kind of mixture of abilities? But I do think that there's a kind of logistical bottleneck that would see that being difficult, which then also suggests that as we move into the future, there's going to be a natural leg up or advantage to the all flair, no policy people like the Trumps, who, if you can make enough stink and noise and chaos, you're going to get the win. And that's a very just disconcerting notion of the future of politics.
Yeah, it only is disconcerting if you feel like we have no real capacity to combine those things, right? And you're pointing to me as a potential example of some kind of mixture of these elements. So my bias is that it is possible to intermingle and combine these things. But I don't think I'm radically unique in that aspect of myself. I think a lot of people are like that. A lot of people can sense that, and it's possible to generate that as a mood, as a vibe. It's possible to set up vetting competitions that preference candidates of that kind. I think the Integral and the Metamodern and the Game B communities are full of a lot of people who are much more between the left and the right than people give them credit for, and often don't speak to that because they know they're going to seem like they're on one of the sides. But I think there are people out there. I think they're findable. But if you say, like the Democrats did, if you don't even have a primary competition, it's not possible to find them. And if you don't think you can accept anybody who isn't very carefully vetted and speaks correctly and never does anything unpredictable, then you're not going to get them on side. But we can set up the conditions that make it more likely for those politicians and those marketing campaigns to come forward. And I think we absolutely need to, because, like you're saying, what you refer to as the whatever it was, the all flash, no substance kind of people, they will dominate unless people with better ideas take over the flair aspect as
Yeah.
well. And the reason that's going to be true is not just because we live in a late modernist society of spectacle. It's because that's what speaks to the mythic population, right? Ryan Nakati and I and a couple of other people had this idea of make amber great again, to use integral speak, right? But they're not wrong. To be in the folk spirit, to be one of the mythic people, to be symbolically rational rather than literally rational, this is not an error, right? It's the bulk of the population. It always has been, and it will be for the foreseeable future. And unless people who have better policies can speak to that mythic dimension and ignite it, then they're going to cede control to those people.
Yeah.
And it happens so regularly now that it almost looks like it's a feature rather than a bug in the system. But I'm hoping that there is a possibility that a fairly large segment of the relatively well-informed, relatively leading edge mainstream will be capable of absorbing some of those lessons.
Yeah, well, one point on that front is also the systemic, or rather, a structural problem that seems also to be a feature, not a bug, which is that, and this is a classic issue, like who are the sorts of people to go into politics, right? There's a reason why you're doing what you're doing and not, courting votes in the Iowa caucus, right? Because at a certain point, the pathway to go down that route seems to self-select for a certain kind of person, and often there's a kind of dark triad that's either there in the narcissism or whatnot, but it does seem to then favor or filter through a kind of either just people who love the spectacle and love to be the center of attention, or people who are just sort of like career professionals seeking to get to the top, in this case the political top. And there really doesn't seem to be a natural attractor for people from kind of more complex ways of thinking and integral style forms of thought to attract them into a space where they're having these kinds of influences. And I don't know what to, I don't, well, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on
I
that.
think the leverage point is in the advisors and in the back rooms,
Yeah.
right? Now, there's a slim but non-zero possibility that eventually I become elected dictator for life in Canada and launch a military invasion into the United States and save you from yourselves. But that kind of like historically fantastical out front sort of move where we see those candidates, that's not really where the change gets made, right? What the change gets made when the people in the back room, the people who are the more shamanic like advisors, can say, here's how we have to run this primary contest. Here's the attitude I think we need to emphasize in the marketing campaign, right? Those sorts of things. So they can sit down with those candidates and say, here's what I like about you. Here's what I don't like about you. This is what we got to focus on. When they say this to you, try to be this, right? And it's not always going to work, but who's creating the ethos that vets for the candidates that lean in this direction, that vets for the policies that lean in this direction, and who sort of organizes and orchestrates the mood that will unfold as the marketing campaigns of the future.
Yeah.
I was part of this team, the Reconstitution team. I don't know if you read
Hmm.
the book that we put out, but right there is a higher order attempt to produce more evolutionary, more integrative political solutions that operate in tandem with the existing political structure and sacred history of a nation and bring together right wing and left wing solutions in novel ways. And there are candidates, there are people out there that can speak to that, but somebody has to encourage that to be the case. And
Yeah.
that somebody is seldom going to be the person who gets elected. It's more often than not going to be the person who's running in the background,
Yeah.
operating something like that. So I think that's where we could expect some of that change in a way that your previous comment indicated. We probably won't see it out in the foreground very soon.
Yeah. Well, moving back down from sort of this ideal and the general to more of like the particular instance of our current historical moment now, the day after this election, are there any other thoughts that you have about where we are at right now and what has just unfolded and transpired that you wanted to bring into this conversation at all?
Just buy crypto and guns. But no, not necessarily. I mean, it depends where we want to go with this conversation. I'm personally in a very interesting position because I have a long accumulated sort of political critique that has so many parts, and each part is so uncommon in the general political discourse that it's hard to really speak to any of it. I have a distance from and an involvement in the American election. I have a distance from an involvement in the political situation in general, right? There's parts of me that all my life have been really emotionally connected with the political situation and very patriotic, and some of those parts have died or spoiled as a result of symbolic actions by leaders of my nation over the last few years. And at the same time, I know a lot of people in the United States, a lot of good friends. I have family members there, and they are concerned, right? And the part of me that wants to be like, hey, it doesn't affect me because I'm not American. It doesn't affect me because I have an identity configuration that exceeds a lot of these things. It doesn't affect me because I'm analyzing it from an Illuminati metascale, right? All of that stuff is true. But I'm deeply sympathetic to and heartbroken when I hear from Americans who tell me this is really bad. We're really worried,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not sure what to make of that yet, right?
Yeah.
Whether they're exaggerated, they're just concerned, whether there really is something going to go bad. One way or another, it's going to be surprising. We're about to embark on a period of astonishments, unparalleled since the last Trump administration. But I mean, that's to me one of the things that the, let's say, professional elite, coastal center, left, neo, whatever we want to call that aspect of the modernist consensus, they don't really get how weird things are going to be now. Right. It seems to me, and it's dispositional and it relates to my shamanic analysis and that kind of stuff. But I think the strange is going to come more intense and faster. And if anybody had that idea and was betting on this election, they would have betted on Trump, saying this is the one that's going to bring the most weird shit the fastest.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think we've seen first of all, anything yet like what are RFK and Elon Musk going to do in this administration? It boggles the mind. And at the same time, everything just comes at the president. He doesn't really get to unroll an agenda. He gets to like, oh my God, there's aliens. Oh my God, there's pirates. Oh my God, this city blew up. Oh my God, everybody's buying this machine now that like mutates everyone's DNA in the nation or whatever it is. Like the cavalcade of astonishments that's going to come. I just hope everybody's braced for that. So like emotionally, I'm extremely concerned about and not sure quite how to situate my relationship to the Americans that I'm hearing from, who I think are the best and brightest in that nation. But what I want to say to everybody is don't expect merely the worst, expect the strangest,
Hmm.
right? Like, hang on, be prepared for weird to be the new normal.
Yeah.
And that has good and bad aspects to it.
Yeah, and I wish that, the weird was sort of in service to the better. But in this case, it's like we're getting the weird because that's what seems to be this attractor, but it seems to be directly connected, tethered to some kind of dark, very easily potentially regressive thing, and that chaos is both the source of, novel complexity, but also chaotic breakdown. Yeah, so there's a kind of there is almost a kind of longing for the right kind of weird, because that's another one of the frustrating aspects about all this. And I think this is a fairly universal recognition that like no one was excited about Kamala Harris, no one was excited about Joe Biden, no one was excited about Hillary Clinton. These are boring people. They might be good kind of bureaucrats, professionals, right? But like no one's sort of really thrilled by those prospects, and so to see this excitement on this other side, but have it not be tethered to any of the kind of qualitative improvements that one would also like to see, is like there is that kind of phenomenon of craning your neck to look at the roadside crash because there's an interest in that, but it's also not necessarily in service to the good. So what you're describing is a fusion or a hybrid of those. I think that would be ideal. But I guess for the next however many years, we're going to be craning our necks to look at the crash, and it's going to be certainly astonishing and bizarre, but most of the time mixed with feelings of disgust and repulsion and sadness.
Sure.
Um,
Well, I mean, to your general point there, yeah. I mean, the question, I think the weirdness is inevitable. The increase of the weirdness is inevitable. And when you're trying to predict the near future, you should bet on the thing that sounds the most fucked up. But that doesn't have to be the negative version of it. It's the negative version only if the best, most competent, most informed, most heartful people don't accept this reality,
mm,
right? So I guess what I'm saying throughout this entire discussion, the cry of my heart is I want the leading edge and backroom Democrats to understand the reasons why people are gambling
yeah,
on this crazy phenomenon and that it's got a, you know, the Republicans have sensed something changing for a number of years. I would probably go back to Newt Gingrich as a moment where the Republicans started to sense that the digital version of pseudo conservatism is going to go crazy, right? And that John McCain's selection of Sarah Palin and the rise of the Tea Party and that whole thing that Trump steps into, there's a lineage
mhm,
there that should have been understood and we can have tracked for a couple decades now. But he's done something really interesting, and I guess I want to come around to some of the shamanic elements,
mhm,
right? That my reading, if you take a very simplistic notion of tribal society and go, there's matriarchs and patriarch chieftains and shamanic witch kinds of characters. Under the conditions of relatively stable society, you choose a chieftain or a matriarch who sounds like they know what they're doing in the normal sense. If the background sense of the world in the tribe is unsettled and unpredictable, then you may need to temporarily supersede temporal authorities and go to the magical weirdo. And if there's no magical weirdo who's available in any good and smart sense, you will choose a dark, insane, foolish sounding magical weirdo because you know that the standard authorities
yeah,
can't handle the chaos. So Trump advertises himself as that kind of a character. He speaks to the mythic base, right, in mythic ways. I watched that thing this morning. He's rambling, which is a beautiful thing too, because he's always trying to, I think, like in Fight Club, he's always really trying to let go, really trying to hit rock bottom, right? He sounded spaced out, like he didn't even want to hold himself up. He's going off on tangents. It's beautiful how little effort he tries to put in, and we should, I think, appreciate the fact that his extraordinary successes have been enabled through things that should not have worked at all. They're all the more extraordinary for how little he's put into them. If his last 2 months of campaigning has been vitriolic rants and tangents, and that, did you see that thing where he just played his playlist for an hour and danced around instead of giving a talk? He's winning doing that, which
Yeah.
makes it all the more extraordinary. But there's something about that, his desire to surrender, his desire to speak from his own unknowingness, his interest in nonlinear patterns, his interest in projecting a character who promises to operate outside the tribal norms, his strong reliance on what I would call trance induction terminology. If anyone's familiar with conversational hypnosis induction, he does it relentlessly. He draws your attention in ways that can do nothing but put you in a trance. They don't give you any information at all, but you can sort of float around with them. And while you're floating around in a trance, he just reminds you that he's the most awesome person and should control the oil reserves. All right. So there's a number of things. Even the whole super team element, which has
Uh-huh.
dominated for the last 2 months in that campaign, to
Yeah.
say, like, I've brought the Justice League together, right? Here's Elon Musk, and here's RFK, and here's Tulsi Gabbard,
Uh-huh.
right? I'm therefore Zeus. I preside over a pantheon.
Uh-huh.
And the fact that it's a pantheon of people who've often hated me and don't like each other shows that I have all the more power because I can embrace this antagonism. So I think those are like a small number of the elements that we should be looking at. And what I don't hear in postmortem election analysis from the mainstream left is really a breakdown of the features of Trump's character, the features of his strategy, the features of his communication style that look like failures but are actually extremely successful.
Yeah. Well, a couple thoughts. One is just, again, like I track with all that, and there's certainly a lot of truth to it. It's a very, again, there's a part of me that hears it a bit as sort of like a very charitable analysis, the way like if you watch a really bad movie, but then you're like, but the way that it was bad was so perfect. And
Yep.
like
Yep.
you can do that kind of thing and it's enjoyable, but it's also like, but it's also a terrible movie. And so there's
Okay,
that.
let me just, I want to come
Yeah.
back to this, but let me just say that. Here's the example. Quentin Tarantino. Okay, Quentin Tarantino, and if anybody hasn't read his book on cinema history, it's really good, Cinema Speculations. But here's a guy who fell in love with bad movies. Grew up in the 70s and 80s, watching these things, sometimes on the drive-in, black exploitation, slaughter, all of these bad movies, right? And experiencing why they're great. And then when it came to his films, what he did was elicit and amplify the qualities that he thought made those bad things great. So the idea is not that they weren't really bad, they were bad. But people loved something about them. If you extract the loved parts and
Mm.
amplify those, then you have something. So if you can
Mm.
look at the Trump phenomenon and go, hey, there's legitimate reasons why human beings like this. They're not legitimate in terms of they're reasonable. They're not legitimate in terms of they're morally advanced, but they are nonetheless legitimate for human beings. And we can take those out and we can do a different version of those things. They don't have to be bound to the bad movie.
Yeah. Well, I find that a very compelling take and I'm very open to it. There's just also this part of me that's like, for me, the metaphor is more like junk food versus, nutritious food. And I feel like the postmortem classic left analysis is like, look, we need the good food. We need broccoli and vegetables. And this is just, sugar garbage. And you can look at sugar garbage and understand why people really like sugar garbage, but it makes them incredibly unhealthy. And, it's winds up being a kind of collective, scourge when people like their health obliterates, right? And I feel like collectively we're experiencing an analog to that in the realm of political discourse of like just everyone's become like a Wall-E creature, and it's like, yeah, we can do that and you can understand why people like it, but it's not necessarily what we need and what is good. And so there's also just like differences between description and prescription there. But I wanted to ask you this though, before we kind of wrap this up, which is, if the world is just getting crazier and things are just going to get weirder, and we're kind of entering into this like everything everywhere all at once sort of existence, should we give up on the idea that like this kind of old classic notion that we can generate a collectively better world through, political conversation and sort of reason sharing and trying to create institutions that lead to public good and all this stuff? Like, should we just abandon the notion, if not of utopia, then protopia, some sense that like the public sphere is a place that we can go to and take pride in and have identity in? Or does the whole like world, the public sphere, just become this like chaos that we have to just kind of abandon to its own insanity and seek meaning and purpose and depth and goodness in other parts of life? Yeah.
Okay. It's complicated, right? I think we need to have the kind of self-esteem and integrity and pragmatism and mixture of idealism and cynicism that empowers us to make even more efforts, right? There's a multipolar situation going on globally where a lot of our seemingly national problems are really multinational problems. There's a situation where the technology is out of human hands already, and we have to deal with that. There's a situation where there's just so many things going on that we actually have to create norms and institutions and a new cultural spirit, like I was saying, and a new set of collective intelligence protocols that are capable of operating at that scale of difficulty. That's all super important. We have to be doing that. I think it's possible and necessary to generate a sacred civic spirit of coherence between people. I don't think it can be done through the mode of trying to protect the value and virtue norms of the modern society that's dominated for the last at least 100, but maybe several hundred years, right? We've got to give a lot of that up. We've got to give up the attitude that's dominant in the administrative back rooms of places like the Democratic Party in the United States, the Liberal Party in Canada, all over the world. Something has to be surrendered there. It's not going to work that way, but we still have to do it. That's all on one side. On the other side, yes, we do have to abandon the public sphere. I am very sympathetic to the Alexander Bard position on this one. I think that the ongoing permutations of the digital technology are creating the situation in which the public space, which was largely a byproduct of print media, is going to turn into, at best, an unpredictable ongoing carnival. At worst, some kind of Grand Central Station graffiti nightmare of civil war.
Mm.
Right now, the best one is possible, right? But the situation is, in order to make these changes, we have to have people who are competent and elite who can play a game in that public mess and tell a different story in private. We have to do collective dispersal into tribal sense making centers. I don't think there is going to be a shared public narrative. I don't think there's going to be a shared public sentiment. I think public is largely something that's going to erode. And that in that open space, what we're going to see is just one madness after another. And that's the arena you have to play in if you're still using a political system whereby you have to sway a majority of people through representational dynamics.
That's fascinating. That gives a lot to chew on and think about. So yeah, I mean, but it is key because, if we're misoriented to the entire goal of the political endeavor, right? If we've misframed that, then of course there's going to be all sorts of ways that there's going to just be breakdown. But if the attractor is more like what you say, then uh, we have to rethink what we even mean by politics. All right, last question, or two questions maybe, I'm not sure, is like, what would you what degree of sort of how do I express this? Like, I guess the question is, first, do you consume much sort of political media? Like for me, I'm checking CNN, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, New York Times dozens of times every day, like every day, not just in election season. I'm always trying to get some kind of media ecology, granted mostly kind of mainstream and whatever, if you want to call that mainstream media. But is that something that you do at all, or have you kind of just, you know, you don't that's a waste of time? How do you engage generally, like the political media landscape, and what would you recommend for people, particularly right after this election right now, who are going to be just kind of doom scrolling and just,
Mhm, mhm.
kind of clockwork oranging it? Yeah.
I've gone through a lot of permutations. I went through a period where my rule was never read the media of a country about itself. So if it was about the American election, I would read it through BBC or Al Jazeera. If it was about the British election, do not trust the BBC, that kind of thing, right? So I think there's something to that, right? And what that is you want at least a secondary perspective built in. And one of the things that I do, and Say and I we watch news every morning, right? With our coffee after I've done my meditation and my exercises. And it's not always political news, right? Sometimes it's what are the new discoveries at Göbekli Tepe or something like that, or the science news or something like that. But a lot of it is a political news, and a lot of that's American political news, which is fascinating to Canadians. And the places where I'm more comfortable getting it are places where there's a secondary perspectival lens that does that filtering. So if it's news from another country about the United States, if it's comedy news, right, I place a lot more credence in that. I do watch, since Jon Stewart returned to The Daily Show,
Yeah.
I've been reappreciating them. I had no interest in them really for quite some years. I do regularly watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, things like that. For a while, I was very much interested in The Hill. If you've seen that, it was a deliberately left wing, right wing combination YouTube media
Mm,
thing. And now
hmm.
it broke down. And then some of the people who did it originally spun off their own podcast series, which bores the hell out of me. But these sorts of things, I think I go to long form media, I go to internet media. I go to media that has, at the very least, high speed, pluralistic, critical analysis that brings a humor lens onto the topic. And I especially like any news that critiques the analysis of the news, right? So that the number of lenses is what's important to me. There was a thing to mention Jon Stewart here. Maybe we've talked about this before, but a study was done years ago for people who only got their news from a single source and how informed were they? And it turned out people who only got their news through The Daily Show were the most informed.
Hmm.
That's extremely weird because The Daily Show is 4 nights a week. It's 22 minutes when the commercials are removed. It's 10 minutes of news when the dick jokes are taken out. So 10 minutes of news 4 times a week. That gets you more informed than 24/7 CNN news or an hour every night on NBC.
That
Why
sounds about
is
right.
that?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is that what gets filtered out is as important as what you get
Mm,
access to in terms of how informed you are.
hmm.
Nassim Taleb has a whole thing about this. Your ability to tell the signal from the noise decreases the more input you take in.
Yeah.
So take it in less often, take it in through a comedy filter, take it in through multiple perspectival lenses. And when you come across an interesting thing, stop watching. Do not
Hmm.
just take the next bit. If you have a partner, spend as much time talking about and analyzing what you just saw as watching it. If it's on your own, stop it and ponder it before you go onto it. Just taking it in as a deluge,
Yeah.
that's, I think, the most debilitating thing possible and leaves us susceptible to either one of these two deleterious attractors that are currently controlling our political space.
Indeed. All right. Well, actual last question, and it's quick, but how do you feel right now? Like not just right now, but right now in a slightly more extended temporal sense, like after this election, Trump president elect, how are you feeling emotively, kind of just orienting towards the future and in your body? There's a lot of scared and nervous and maybe triumphalist people out there as well, certainly, right? But like, how would you describe how this is landing for you emotionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Intellectually, I'm worried. Emotionally, I'm not as worried,
Hmm.
right? Intellectually, it's very clear that a lot of the people involved in the team that just won are very dangerous and regressive people. We should be concerned as a cultural phenomenon. However, I personally don't feel that worried. Maybe it hasn't set in yet, or maybe I'm just in a different kind of space. But I'm, like I said earlier, sympathetic to and concerned about the future of vulnerable populations within the United States. That bothers me emotionally. But in general, I feel kind of benign neutrality and also a curiosity about some of these things. I'm not a condemner of RFK and Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard. I think they're very interesting characters, and I'm curious to see what they would actually do. Right? I've found RFK to be an intriguing, adaptable, complex person who's not well represented by the media and the left wing take on him. And I'm not 100% convinced he's going to make health worse. He might make it better, right? Elon Musk has done some awful and some interesting things. And if he was put in charge of NASA or any number of things, NASA, sorry, now I lived in the Bahamas as a kid, I say NASA. Uh, I'm kind of excited to see how the car crash turns out. And I don't think it will all be negative. I
Yeah.
think there will be a more or less indifferent spread of wildly terrible and wildly interesting and some positive things.
Hmm.
But more to the point, like I've said earlier, my real emotional feeling is underneath all of that, just this cry for Democrats, for liberals, for anybody on the progressive or center left to start to really take these lessons on board and stop thinking that the way your attitude, your communication approach, the things you emphasize in public, stop thinking that's going to work. You have to really take this chaos and this strangeness and this stupidity on board somehow. You've got to become the mythic, shamanic, idiotic, spectacle version of labor improvements, social changes, new welfare, ecological adjustments. We need that. We need a green Trump. We 100% need a green Trump.
Hmm. Oh man. Well, fascinating as always. Deeply appreciate it. Both just, your ideas, but also your always reassuring demeanor and general sensibility and
Yeah,
attitude.
I want to check in on that. Like you, I mean, are you okay?
Well, this helps. I mean, your analysis, there's a lot there that I definitely agree with. There's some really novel points that I'll have to chew on. And on the whole, I strive to find myself more in an equanimous state of being around these sorts of things. Um, I I usually know when I've gone, there's like that little, I don't know, that like pang of conscience or whatever, that like, I'll take a post down or something when it's like, no, I just shouldn't engage at that level. There's a higher level to engage with this stuff at. And it's very clear to me that so much of the way that most of this is being engaged with is certainly at a level that is, I find, problematically simplistic, but I'm always trying to kind of level up my own perspective on this. And I still feel deeply embedded in it, and that's probably also just a reality of being an American citizen and whatnot. But it does bother me more. And we were talking, you brought this up a little bit at the Metamodern Spirituality Lab. I have a disposition that probably tends a bit more to the I don't know, more of that kind of romantic depressiveness. So I feel things very intensely, and I try to balance that with my own sort of intellectual analysis, but then also feeling it very profoundly. I think that's one of the things that struck me most about what's just happened, is that, like, intellectually I could tell you, well, of course this would happen, but then when it happens, it's like a gut punch. And then I need to somehow balance that off the fact that other very decent people that I know who are incredibly intelligent have a very, very different perspective on the whole thing. And I somehow need to integrate that, not in a sense of it necessarily agreeing with it, but trying to find those points of commonality. And some of what you just said helps be able to do that, where we can focus more on some of these structural or even stylistic elements and see the kind of deep connection and sort of attractiveness about some of these things, even as you can somehow maintain the problematic nature of it. So I'm sitting with a lot of cognitive dissonance, I guess, And then there is also, it's kind of that feeling after like Trump almost got killed, where that was so kind of handled so epically that you're kind of like, oh man, you're almost kind of disappointed about like how cool it was because it was sort of like, but I'm like not rooting for this guy, but like, wouldn't it be cool if something like if someone did that where I actually could get behind this person because I'd like to feel a kind of triumphant, like that was so badass feeling. So being in a situation where kind of culturally the majority of the country is celebrating right now, and there seems to be some kind of momentous turn away from an old way of doing things, which is something I long to experience, but can't feel myself in this particular moment because I interpret that turn largely in negative terms. Yeah, there's just a whole bunch of cognitive dissonance and mixed emotions and tensions between head and heart. So I don't know, maybe in a nice Gurdjieffian sense, I can use that for my own spiritual development. But that's mainly what I'm sitting with, apart from just all of the other
Yeah.
things that we were talking about. So yeah, that would be how I'd frame where I'm at.
Yeah. I mean, the inner work thing, it's always a good time for inner work. You take advantage of whatever comes up. I think we need to be thinking about how do we build a future politics that can outperform this.
Hmm.
I think we need to be thinking about uh, how do we express sympathy for and support and protect the most vulnerable in the population, especially the ones who are our friends and allies
Yeah.
who might really suffer under this new condition. We also have to be thinking about how we embrace and appreciate the population that voted in this way, that they are not foreign or strange or somehow fundamentally flawed, that there are people there to embrace and people there to understand. And also for the communities that we're in, we have to think transpolitically, right? We have to think of every situation, oh, good, right? This is the perfect situation in which to advance metamodernism, in which to advance cosmic complexity, in which to advance an integral agenda and a non dual agenda and an ecological agenda. Whatever we're doing, the situation is right for us to do that.
Well, I will say on that last point, I have also felt a kind of strange tension in wrestling with that insight because I actually do feel like this change will be more productive for all of those things, in the sense of moving forward the kinds of concerns of this metamodern agenda. Because when I think back to the kind of community that built up online in this space in response to the pandemic and the Trump election and the kind of chaos that was going on, um, there was a sense in which, wow, things are really messed up. This feels a little bit like the world's ending, but hey, we're going to make the world better. We're going to make it better together, and we're going to come together and do this thing. That I felt like has a lot of that intensity has drifted away. At least it's found different pockets and it's sort of diffused. I don't think that the it's not that it's been lost, it's just been reorganized. But I do think that this is kind of galvanizing. There's a galvanizing aspect to what we're going through again. And I feel like we're entering a new kind of, yeah, a Trump era 2.0. And to the degree that that was a huge galvanizing force before for this community to sort of consider the situation that we're in and come together and try to do something around it, it becomes a lot harder to ignore the systemic issues of breakdown and collapse the way that it is when you've got kind of just a milquetoast neoliberal Harris or Biden in office, where it's sort of like, oh, okay. So I think that intensity is going to be productive. And again, I feel cognitive dissonance about that because it almost seems very kind of myopically parochial to kind of even think in those terms. But I do think that that's something, at least if we're looking desperately for silver linings for those folks who, are feeling really distraught about all this, we can at least kind of focus on that and think about this as a way to, bring our energies together. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there'll be a clarifying and a mobilizing energy that's available here. I think we also have to take seriously what this shows us about what's possible, which is to say anything, right? That very astonishing, very improbable, very strange things are on the table. Right? We are not bound by the normal protocols and norms of politics and society in a way we might have thought we were. If this can happen, all kinds of things can happen. And that's an open space in which people who have a healthy, smart agenda can move in and try to be as magical and astonishing as these forces. But at the same time, let's not miss the opportunity to feel bad if we feel bad, right? Grief is its own process. And if you're upset about this, good, be upset about it. Like you don't have to tell yourself a silver lining story necessarily. It takes some time to feel bad.
Yeah, indeed. Um, Thank you, my friend. As always, again, as I say, it's always very, encouraging in the etymological sense, to speak with you. It's very heartening, and I appreciate your perspective, not just for its intellectual take, but because of the deep soulness to it, and for the genuine wisdom that's there. So hopefully this was helpful and certainly interesting for other people. I hope. I think this kind of conversation is actually really important. So maybe we also think about having more of these kinds of conversations. I think there will be a need for that going forward, and we might want to think about somehow developing that itself as kind of a protocol so that we can get better at this way of thinking and talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I put a lot of time and effort and have a lot of emotional history around politics, and I don't think our communities put enough time into that in the foreground. And also, I hope to God I got that pie out of the oven in time.
I hope it's delicious, my friend. Much appreciated as always.
Yeah,
Godspeed. Till
see you
next
soon,
time.
friend.
Okay.
All right.